In this video, I will show you how to apply a basic solid color floor epoxy and most importantly, give you my honest opinion about this brand, Magic Resin, which at the end of the day, I do not recommend, as you will see. From the beginning, I was frustrated by trying to pour out the resin, part A, into the bucket because it is thick and should not be sold in a bottle. Some of the reviews on Amazon mention the same thing, so I'm not just being a crybaby. Same thing with the pigment. It was hard to squeeze out, and if you decide to do a second layer or an adjacent area, the color could turn out different because you could end up with more or less resin and most importantly, pigment. Other brands I have worked with come with the resin already in a bucket. I mixed part A with the pigment using a small mixing paddle and an electric drill at the lowest setting for a few minutes. Then I poured in part B, the hardener, which is more liquid and not as hard to pour in. I switched to a larger mixing paddle to make it more efficient. The instructions say to mix for about 2 to 3 minutes and that you have about 20 to 45 minutes after that to work with the product before it starts to harden, so that makes applying epoxy floors a little stressful. But before we get into the application, a word of caution. If you use a very fast setting on your drill, you could end up with bubbles in your floors, so use the lowest speed setting to avoid this problem. You can also technically mix by hand, but I would not recommend that as it would take too long and then you will have less time to work with the product. Then, of course, you pour out your mixed solution onto the floor in different areas and start spreading it out with a paint roller and or squeegee and or spiked roller, and use a brush around the edges. I would recommend removing baseboards prior to application to get a clean, professional, even finish, and to avoid having those baseboards glued in place if you ever need to remove them to apply a different type of flooring. I was doing a small closet space and was too lazy to remove the baseboards, so you'll see how that turns out. Also, make sure to tape at least a foot up of the walls because you will get splatter on the walls like I did. You can buy some plastic painting tarps or just use contractor bags, which are slippery but handy. Also, make sure to cover the surrounding floor areas so you have somewhere to put your dirty tools as well as to prevent getting splatter everywhere. Also, it is very important in the application of epoxy floors to invest in some spiked shoes. You will need to walk over top of the epoxy to even it out, and these cleats make it possible for you to do so without ruining the work with your shoes. They will not leave hole marks since the epoxy is self-leveling. I bought this kit from Amazon, which has all those products. I also linked some brushes and roller sleeves in the comments. Make sure to even out the epoxy as much as possible, and at the end you may want to roll over the whole thing with a spiked roller to prevent bubbles from forming. They say you can also use a heat gun to kill the bubbles, but I don't have any experience with this. By the way, you may be tempted to flip over your bucket after you pour out the product and leave it to get any remaining solution out, but I warn you against doing this because what's left over in the bucket may be unmixed resin from the walls of the bucket, and this will literally never harden, much like an oil. So do yourself a favor and don't try to salvage the last leftovers in your bucket. And I speak from experience, at least with another brand. The epoxy I poured in this closet was the remainder from another small area that I did in the kitchen, and for this reason it may have turned out a little weird because it's a thin application with the little leftovers. There weren't too many bubbles, but there were some bare spots where the paint underneath shows, and also some dark spots where the pigment may not have been mixed well. Perhaps I didn't mix it long enough, which caused dark spots, but I think the pigment container they provide is problematic and perhaps dried out or past its shelf life, resulting in discoloration. At the end of the video, I will show similar problems in the first area where I poured out the first half of the bucket. But for now, let's talk about transitions. This closet happens to be in an enclosed space that is below the level of the rest of the room because of added layers of flooring outside the closet, meaning I could just paint up to the edges. But if you are pouring in a room where you have to make a transition to a floor that is at the same level, my hack is to use this thick caulk tape tape to make a boundary. You cannot simply paint a line with a paintbrush or use flat tape where you want the epoxy to end, because it is truly self-leveling and will slowly creep over that tape if the floor is level or lower in the adjacent area. And if you put that caulk tape in a low-lying area, the epoxy could even go over top of that and into the next area. You also have to consider this if you pour over tile or any uneven or unlevel areas. This epoxy will leave any high areas bare and untouched and the low areas filled. For this reason, I actually recommend painting your floor first with a floor paint of a similar color prior to application, especially around the edges of the wall, because the area where the floor meets the walls is usually the highest area in the room due to the foot traffic and sagging being in the middle of the room, and you will get bare areas where the floor meets the walls. Of course, if you replace the baseboards after you're done, or use shoe molding or do a second layer, this won't be as much of a problem, but applying floor paint even just around the wall edges is pretty easy. Now let's talk about the not so fun part, the surface preparation. The magic resin instructions tell you to clean and even sand or grind your floor first, depending on what type of floor you're covering, which I recommend you use ChatGPT to figure out the best way to prepare your surface. This will be the hardest part of the whole job and probably the most important. Make sure to really put in the time and scrub your floors of any dirt and grease and dust, and give it plenty of time to dry. If the floor is a shiny tile or a porous concrete or even wood, I would also recommend priming it with a floor primer and let that dry for 24 hours. I also decided to paint the whole wood floor in the closet with a gray floor tile paint by Rust-Oleum, although you will see that this smoke gray shade is much lighter than the light gray magic resin shade. This Rust-Oleum brand floor paint is very low rated on Amazon, but I think it works well as a base coat so that the white primer does not shine through. Just make sure to find the right shade. Then I waited 24 hours to do the first layer of epoxy. The instructions also say that if you wish to apply a second coat of epoxy over the first, wait a few hours and do it before the first coat fully hardens, which is not very specific as far as time frame. Then wait a few days before walking on it. And I like to share what I did with the majority of the epoxy mixture before I did the closet. I had an area in my kitchen where I removed the base cabinets and had a 1-inch deep hole that was created due to layers of flooring being added around the base cabinets that I needed to level out to place new cabinets. I decided to fill this hole with some scrap wood from the old cabinets and level it with some epoxy paint because it levels itself. And also I just wanted to test out this brand and color. As you can see, this was an easy application as I did not have to walk over it. Just put on some knee pads and spread it out with a small squeegee. Around the edges, I used caulk tape to prevent the epoxy from creeping into the rest of the flooring in the kitchen, which is a multicolored gray epoxy from the Ballistics brand that I will review in another video and I liked much better and will link as well in the comments. One major complaint that I saw about the Magic Resin brand and about other floor coatings is low coverage area. This gallon kit is supposed to cover 200 to 300 square feet, but I cannot speak to these numbers. I just want to advise that it's better to buy more than you need and spread it on thick rather than thin, and do a small area rather than a larger area. Anyway, the finished product in the kitchen also had some bare spots where the epoxy did not stick to the wood. This could be solved using a primer, perhaps, since the surface of the wood is slick and shiny, or maybe this brand just has poor adhesion. Same thing with some spots on the edge of the wood where there is no coverage, as if the epoxy never even touched it, but you can see that it did during the application. Some people complained about this online as well. And they also said that it scratches easily, but I didn't test that out too much. You can also see some splatter on the walls, but that can easily be prevented. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sure you can tell that I'm not sponsored by this brand, but I will link it in the comments as well as all the products I use in this video. Please make sure to click on those links to support my work, as well as comment, follow, like, subscribe, share, all the above to help me support my work.